Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences between Atlas Shrugged and the Fountainhead, and which one I prefer and which one is the objectively better novel, so to speak. So just for a little bit of history of me reading the novels, I read the Fountainhead first, and then I read Atlas Shrugged after that. I started reading the Fountainhead because Rucka suggested it when he was on the Rubin Report, and he was really the one who kind of inspired me to get more into reading Ayn Rand and more into Ayn Rand. So that's kind of where I began. I picked up the Fountainhead, read that, and saw how much that applied to my life. Saw a lot of aspects of Peter Keating in myself, and that scared me because Rand does an amazing job of showing the consequences of Peter Keating's thoughts and Peter Keating's actions. Um, and she also shows this character of Roark, who I saw as a sort of ideal to strive towards. And I saw in my own life how Roark was like. When I acted like Roark, my life was better, my life was happier. So I kind of saw him as a sort of ideal to pursue. Then I read Atlas Shrugged after that, and wow, that was what an amazing book. Um, just all the full fledged, like her whole philosophy just laid out there. Um, and like just seeing Reardon's views on sex and stuff like that really impacted me because I grew up religious and had a very toxic view on sex and stuff like that. Um, the politics of it all just clicked really well with me because I've always been fairly pro freedom. I started out as a libertarian and I just kind of uh, went more into objectivism as I learned more about the philosophy. Uh, but yeah, and the character of Dagny was a really good character, I thought. And I have this tendency of when I see girls that I would really like, I like start to compare them to Dagny. It's not necessarily the best habit because it led me to have way too much confidence, and it leads me to have way too much confidence in certain girls, and not necessarily the best thing to say, oh, this girl is Dagny, so I need her. That's not necessarily the best mentality to have. Uh, but whatever. Now for some comparison between the two. My favorite book was The Fountainhead, just because of how much that affected my life and how clearly of an impact it had on my life. And I don't know, part of it just makes me like that really changed my sense of life. And now, like, when I look at buildings and shit like that, like, I'm just in absolute awe. Like, this view, y'all can't see it super well because the lighting kind of weird, but um, I I got this amazing view from my hotel room of just the city, and it's amazing. I just love looking at all the architecture and just thinking like a human being's mind created this. This began as in the human mind, and someone conquered reality by obeying its laws and created this structure, and it's just amazing to see. And they created this structure for trade and win-win transactions and production and all that amazing stuff. I find buildings to be extremely beautiful now, and I often have like these what people when I was religious would call these like religious experiences, I guess, these spiritual experiences. I often have those now when just looking at buildings or just thinking about looking at buildings in the awe of what people have produced, or looking at even just like I remember on Thanksgiving last year, uh, like I had this really profound experience of just like looking at my phone and just thinking about everything that went into that, and just all of that, and that was like a really profound experience of gratitude and awe. And that was one thing that the Fountainhead definitely produced in me. And also just this idea of being uncompromising, unwilling to give sacrifice my standards to other people, or live for others, or always care what other people think, because I definitely had that as a big habit and was leading me into very a depressing sort of state, because I was always concerned with what other people would think about me, and it so it'd lead me to never talk, and then I'd go home and cry because I because I felt bad for never being able to talk. Um, that was always a really bad thing. But then I kind of accepted that. Like, for one, I accepted, like, it's okay if I don't talk. I mean, who do I need to impress? I just need to be myself. And actually, as I began to accept not talking as much, I began to talk more and become a lot more social and a lot more confident in general, just because who gives a fuck what other people think? It's my life. And if I'm constantly sacrificing my standards for other people, I'm not an actual person anymore. I'm just a mixture of all these people. There was a quote in the Fountainhead that was about that. Uh, there was like, this lady didn't even exist. She was just all the opinions of her other friends mangled into one person, or something like that. Um, Now I loved Atlas Shrugged too. Yeah, I could talk about these books all day, but we're doing a comparison here. Um, I thought, yeah, loved Dagny. Dagny was amazing. Uh, John Galt. I mean, he's obviously like a very ideal type person. However, I felt like he wasn't as developed as well as Rourke was throughout the story, since he just kind of popped up at the end. He was working behind the scenes. He's a great character, great ideal hero. Had an amazing speech. Loved that. But I felt Roark was more developed, and I felt more of an attachment and connection to him. Um, just having him as this concrete ideal to pursue, and like seeing the positive aspects of myself that Roark had. I'm not saying that I identified with Roark. That's actually a very, very toxic way to read Rand's novels and think, oh, I am Roark or I am Galt. That's a very toxic way to read them. Um, it's I mean, because we're not automatically rational beings. We grow up in a culture that gives us so many mixed premises, and yeah. So I personally identified with Keating and Reardon. Um, Reardon in the fact or Reardon because I was a little less second-handed at the time, but I still had some pretty mixed premises on sex at the time of reading Atlas Shrugged, and Keating because I was just so second-handed um, before I read The Fountainhead. Um, but yeah, I think Rourke was a better protagonist, or like ideal man sort of character than John Galt. Although that's not necessarily true. There's aspects of Rourke which are not as like thought out and developed as Galt, but I think Rourke was a more I shouldn't have used the word developed back there, but Rourke was more of a developed character throughout the novel. But Galt was more principled, I guess. Rourke, because Rourke was willing to build like public housing and stuff like that. I think, if I remember correctly, I think there was some instance where he built public housing. I don't remember if that was the final thing at the end. That was I'm forgetting specifics. I remember the principles. I'm forgetting specifics. I remember he built some housing for, or he designed some housing for Keating, and Keating just fucked it up, and he had to blow it up because that's intellectual property rights for you. You can't take someone's intellectual property and destroy it pretty much without consequence. But yeah, but Galt would have never done that. Galt would not work for uh, the government, who basically just wants to use his mind and force his mind into conforming to their will and basically restrict his mind. He would not. Galt would never do that. Uh, but yeah, I felt like I liked The Fountainhead a lot better because it applied more directly to my life. And I think when I recommend books, I usually recommend The Fountainhead because I feel like Atlas Shrugged, you already need somewhat of an interest in Rand's ideas, and you can't. And I think a lot of people are turned off by a super political novel like Atlas Shrugged is, but Fountainhead like is more directly accessible, and it's more directly applicable to people's lives. Like you can, it's very easy to because it's very focused on one sort of thing. It's just focused on secondhandedness. Um, so it's a lot easier for someone to read and take some lessons from it. While Atlas Shrugged is a whole philosophy and put into one novel, which is good, and it's a very good book to read. I recommend both to anybody. But I definitely recommend The Fountainhead first because it's a lot easier to digest and easily comprehend. But if you're not already interested in Rand's philosophy, but Atlas Shrugged, if you're interested in her philosophy, it gives a very holistic very detailed, uh, a very good concrete image of these abstract principles that she talks about. And I think overall that makes Atlas Shrugged a objectively sort of better novel because it covers so much more and does so much more in portraying an entire philosophy rather than one aspect of it, like the Fountainhead. But I definitely got a lot more out of the Fountainhead reading that, and I think people who, because people get very turned off by sort of what they view as political commentary, because some people are like, oh, politics, that's boring, or other people are like, oh, this is just political propaganda, and they'll just discount the rest of the novel just because of the politics of it if they don't necessarily agree with those. And it's a lot harder to change people's mind on politics than on ethics and stuff like that. So I think ultimately I'd recommend the Fountainhead to anybody who hasn't read any Rand yet. But if you're already interested in Rand and are not going to be just turned off completely by the politics, I'd highly recommend Atlas Shrugged. Um, but I'd definitely start with Fountainhead no matter what. That's, yeah. Uh, I guess now I'm not trying to shy away from controversy with that point about Atlas Shrugged. I'm not very. I'm even just reading The Fountainhead is very controversial stuff, but I think she does a convincing job throughout. But I think people get very turned off by political commentary. That's not to say that Atlas Shrugged is not a good book. I'd recommend anyone read it, even people who aren't familiar with Rand. But I definitely think that The Fountainhead is more like focused and more, or not focused, um, more talks about one sort of issue, while Atlas Shrugged is more in depth, and the politics could turn off people who aren't interested in politics or are super opposed to Rand's politics. Because ultimately, you have to start with ethics, or not. Well, you start with metaphysics and you go up to epistemology, but you can't have a political system without an ethical system. And Rand does this well in Atlas Shrugged, so I'd say it's still a good book to read. But if people gloss over the ethics and simply focus on the politics when reading the book, they're not going to get the full message out of it. And I think there's definitely a section of people who would miss a lot of the good, strong, like ethical critique of our society, which is so much more important. Um, just looking at the political philosophy, and that's not a criticism of Rand's books at all. I think she does a perfect job of um, explaining how the ethics and the politics interact. It's more a criticism of people who might be reading the books uh, without without the ability to think properly about these sort of issues. But that's not to say you shouldn't recommend Atlas Shrugged. Definitely recommend Atlas Shrugged to people. I just usually do the Fountainhead, and I usually prefer the Fountainhead because it had so much more of an impact on my life. And I say the Fountainhead probably completely changed my life. But yeah, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Peace.